Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Mazeros, and I'm the Ergonomics Research Coordinator at CRE-MSD. And on behalf of our director, Dr. Jack Callahan, I would like to thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to welcome you to this webinar titled Practical Strategies for Implementing MSD Prevention into Your Workplace, Lessons from the Evolution of Magna's Ergonomics Program. We would also like to acknowledge and thank the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development for their funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, as well as our presenters for sharing their expertise. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few administrative details. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be provided along with the presentation slides shortly after today's session. Please note that participant names will not be visible in the recording. Today's webinar format will consist of the presentation, followed by 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers with our presenter. Please enter your questions into the Q&A feature. I will relay those questions to our presenter, combining similar questions where appropriate. If you cannot locate the Q&A feature, please select the More button on the toolbar. We have also included a screenshot in the chat which shows you where to locate the Q&A feature. Also, please refrain from using the raise hand button as we will not be monitoring this feature. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please send us a message in the chat. Following the webinar, you will receive a link to an evaluation survey. One of our key measures is understanding the impact of our webinars, so we greatly appreciate if you take a few minutes to complete this short survey. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Gary Au. Gary serves as the Director of the Global Ergonomics Program and Disability Management at Magna International Incorporated, one of the world's largest automotive suppliers. With over 22 years of dedicated service at Magna, Gary was the first ergonomist appointed at the corporate level. Since then, he has played a pivotal role in establishing a structured, company-wide ergonomics framework and has been instrumental in driving the implementation of effective ergonomics programs across all manufacturing sites at Magna. Gary is a certified professional ergonomist. He holds a Master of Engineering in Mechanical and Industrial Engineering from the University of Toronto, a Master of Science in Ergonomics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology through the Ergonomics option at University of Waterloo. Gary, thank you so much for taking the time to share the evolution of Magna's ergonomics program with us today. Now over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for that warm welcome. And certainly it's an honor and a pleasure to share with you with this great group of professionals. My plan today is pretty simple. I wanted to bring to you 20 years of my experience, or over 20 years, some of the lessons learned from our program. You know, there certainly was a lot of ups and downs throughout the years, but hopefully some insights can help you with your company, your program. So today's agenda covers off these main five areas. You can see it's kind of put together like a journey or like a timeline in the sense. And I think this does stretch quite far back if you see even the early years. But it is important for me to discuss some of the things that Magna did early on in the ergonomics program, as these may be some of the things that might be instrumental for some of you who are starting the ergo program or in midstream. So I think we'll go through the early years and then sort of talk about the implementation of a systematic program we put in place. And after that, we'll look at some of the key lessons, key drivers that we learned over that 5 year period, and then leading to the last part, which for the last decade or so, really working on continuous improvement of our program year after year. So before I get started, some of you may have heard of the company Magna or may not know a lot about it. So I wanted to just give you a scope of the company so that you can understand some of the context that's going to come later, how it ties to some of the business that we do, or what we do in our business. We are, as Kim said, we're a global automotive supplier. Last year, our sales were 42 billion. We have over 150,000 employees at our company currently, and about 330 manufacturing plants globally. And you can see there we do have a global presence. I would say that in the areas of For example, North America, we have a significant portion. That's Canada, US, Mexico. We have 139 facilities there. In Europe, we also have a pretty big presence, 100 assembly or manufacturing sites. And then, of course, in Asia as well, we have about a pretty big region of 70, pretty big cluster of plants, about 78 from the manufacturing side. So that's just give you an idea of the scope of the company and where we operate. But probably more importantly is I wanted to try to explain how our company is broken up into different groups, main groups, I'll call it. And really, each of these different groups are specific commodities within the vehicle parts that we build. And you can see them here, and including in Austria, where we will assemble complete vehicles. But the important thing as we go through this webinar is that each of the groups are in itself their own reporting structures, and they all have their own group presidents that these plants that fall under one of these main groups do report up to. And I think that's an important starting point before we jump into the program is that people are listening have a good understanding of the structure because often every company is quite different in the way they approach ergonomics, the way they can. It's widely different sometimes because of their structure. So for Magna, at least, uh, ergonomics falls within the health and safety department. It is under the umbrella of HR. We do have global standards that are established across all plants. And typically, a plant manager, they're responsible for meeting these global standards, but also reporting to their respective presidents. So I think importantly is to recognize that Magna has a pretty highly decentralized model when it comes to the way it operates. Individual plants have significant autonomy in making the decisions that make the most sense for their plant or their business, and while still trying to align to our corporate standards. So the early years, I'm going to start down the first 2 years, especially that's when I started as well. When I came in, there was really certain things that I felt were important to tackle. And in those 2 years, we looked at redeveloping the ergonomics section within this health and safety audit. So beefing it up to have more requirements um, and more criteria. So one of them was to have each plant to make sure they had an ergonomics committee, also to give them comprehensive training, which involved having workshops or learning a set of standardized ergonomic analysis tools. That was pretty important, as well as establishing a engineering design guideline and checklist. So for new workstations or launches, the plants had a way to go down to see where those risks are. And all this facilitated through obviously the ergonomics committee and proper active management of their ergonomic action plans. So after a couple years re-looking at these things, there was a turning point in our program, and I would say a turning point in a sense is when a pilot project surfaced, and we had one of our Magna groups. They had suffered quite a bit of workers' compensation costs from their claims for MSDs. And so it was an excellent opportunity to launch a pilot project. And this one specifically was with 11 plants. As you can see, this was a pretty low tech rollout. You can see that the criteria was sent around with a Word document. We tracked the results through Excel and provide them. But the important thing is that we had a metric system based on these five categories: support infrastructure, risk assessments or top five risks and prioritization, engineering design, and tracking ergonomic statistics. Each of these five categories in the pilot, they would get a red, yellow, or green on a scorecard for each of these five categories. And so as we track this, these are the 11 plants listed on the side and the five categories at the top. You can see when we started, there was a lot of yellow and red blocks indicating that these were areas that were not doing so well. But quickly in 6 months' time, you can see the change of much more greener blocks, meaning that these plants, these 11 plants, were starting to implement the important elements of an effective ergonomics process. Fast forward a year from then, for about a year after our pilot projects, we started to measure the significance when it comes to MSD injuries. So in this case, the easiest way was looking at our injury claims in the U.S., specifically 3 plants. And part of that reason is because we have a private insurance carrier that collects, we can get very detailed stats. So we knew exactly how many ergonomic injuries or claims were happening at these plants. So when you looked at frequency, we could see that at least 2 or 3 of them had significant reduction when we compared 2005 to 2006, a reduction in injuries during the first year of the pilot. Equally important we saw was the severity or the injury ergonomics injury cost also was reduced. You can see across all 3 of those U.S. plants, we saw a tremendous amount of difference on and potential savings compared to what those plants were paying before the pilot and after the year after the pilot. All in all, the total, as we started to continue to track the results of the workers' comp and claims 2 years after, you can see that we had a total rebate for these 3 U.S. plants of 2.5 million US dollars. And this is basically the combined total of 2006 and 2007, the 2 years we're playing. So in a way, there's a certain premium paid out by these plants, and we were able to show that the value of rebate dollars back into the pockets of these plants and a sizable savings for them. So with the success of the pilot project from these 11 divisions, the impact quickly spread, and it was much easier to justify or pitch to management at this point how we could help the many other plants at Magna. It pretty much gave us a green light when it came to scaling this pilot further across our company. So that leads me to my next uh, section here where uh, I'm calling it implementing a systematic ergonomics approach. We started in 2007, and you can see the systematic approach was built off of sort of the categories that you already saw in the pilot, but we further added significant more criteria to make it a more robust PDA cycle, plan, do, check, act system. And you can see if you look around each of these blue blocks, you can see you can't read it probably on the screen, but you can see that there's individual criteria or requirements we put around each phase to ensure that each of these phase of these cycles well supported and well accountable to our plants. This is a good opportunity also to plug the MSD Prevention Guidelines for Ontario. When I look at some of the elements that we've put in and also what's the MSD Prevention Guideline for Ontario, they are very aligned in a lot of similar things. And I think that's important because as we go through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to present to you a lot of things that Magna did or certain things that we chose to do. But this also, I'm going to provide for everyone an icon in the top right corner, as you can see, that shows you the step in the MSD prevention guideline that some of the things we do that align to. And this is important or advantageous, especially if there's something you liked, or maybe there's something that you might think about doing from some of the things that Magna did, that there's a reference to go to, at least to look at the framework or to help build these areas in your program. So look for the icons in the corner. So as I mentioned, in 2007, we really started going heavy into a systematic PDCA model when we launched a very robust ergonomics scorecard that measured performance. We moved from the 3-level colored system scale to a 5-level color scale that goes from all the way from green to red. The five categories, as you can see, which are support infrastructure, analysis and prioritization, implementation and risk reduction, engineering design, and metric communication. The scores on these five categories combine together in order to produce a single overall ergonomic score for each plant. Um, you can see on the right side, this is what were well, we got the green light at the time, which was very instrumental, was getting a customized web application where we could house the scorecard results and also communicate on online with the same with feedback, and more importantly, the plants themselves could really see their where which areas they were achieving credit for and which areas they were not on a quarterly basis. We had regional at the ergonomists, corporate ergonomists that would review their programs digitally. And if there was something that didn't meet the requirements, they would put a red flag and provide detailed feedback on how they could get achieve that criteria in the next quarter. So that gives you hopefully an idea of how this digital online audit worked on a quarterly basis. And these are some of the um, key areas that helped us drive the scorecard. I think, and as I was saying, the online system really helped us because from a management perspective, we had quarterly visibility. And I think it really did, even for some management who didn't really buy into the program ergonomics at the beginning, they certainly cared about this screen or this shot because it shows their overall scores, but it also shows their quarterly trends. So plant managers were starting to be concerned when they saw that they weren't getting greens anymore on the overall score. But the good thing about this quarterly performance trend is also you could see which categories of the five categories that they're struggling with, and then they could act on it and provide support or ask questions on how they can improve their scores. So implementing this program over the 5 years that we did it, um, we saw, and even to this day, we likely, our team saw hundreds of ergonomic programs launch in the sense of putting in ergonomic committees, getting training, doing risk assessments or ergonomic assessments, and putting in fixes, putting in solutions. So I think we had a pretty good sample size of things that worked well and things that didn't. We also made sure to keep track of like what are some of the key items that drove the impact and effectiveness in our ergonomics program through all this, seeing all these plants go through it and successes and struggles. So what I wanted to do in this section was just give you some of those key lessons learned and those key drivers that we feel that really helped us during these years. The first one is effective ergonomic committees. We One of the requirements was that every ergonomics team or committee had to assign an ergonomics coordinator. In most cases, it may not have been their full-time job, but definitely a big part of their job was coordinating the ergonomics program. Ergonomic committee members also, it was important for them to have time in between their meetings, whether it's monthly or bi-weekly, to have time to perform assessments, follow up with workers, and implement the solutions. All the key members on the ergonomics committee were trained in all of the ergonomic analysis tools. And we thought that was very important that every member of the team, whether you're a shop floor worker or operator or on the engineering team, that all people on this team were equally empowered when it comes to making decisions. So some of the things that we audited or measured during this this plan, do, check, access, and the requirement included ensuring they had provided evidence of monthly meetings with significant activity, also ensuring that they had action plans or at least items that would show that they are moving towards completing some of these solutions on their team. So there was a few items that were very important, and these were that we felt that created the right atmosphere, the right team dynamics for effective ergonomics on these teams. Another requirement that was pretty instrumental was mandating engineering partnership from the start. When we decided on making the engineering manager or requiring the engineering manager to champion the committee and putting a high value as far as point value onto this criteria, I knew we were in for a battle. And that's exactly what we got. There was a lot of resistance. You would hear about how busy the engineering manager is, or how behind they are on a launch. So there was a lot of resistance on that responsibility. But my advice after going through that for many years was that um, is to really weather the storm because it's temporary. And I've seen some of the best advocates for ergonomics are the same engineering managers who didn't buy in at the beginning, but now they see now they see ergonomics as helping their job and their operational goals. Everyone's probably heard the saying, what gets measured gets done. And this is the approach we also took when it came to ergonomic risk assessments. We wanted to use quantitative risk assessments to drive action. And the reason being that by using risk scores, and risk ratings, it ensured an objective evaluation of jobs and job risks. It provided this consistent data-driven language across operations, engineering, and management. I've had very little, I mean, over the years, I've had very little people challenging me on the validity of these ergonomic assessment tools, whether it was engineering or ops. They didn't really challenge the validity of the ergonomic assessment tools. So that kind of tells me that people just want a number. And I certainly know that numbers is speaking the language of operations and engineering, and it actually provides a means for them to solve the problem. Using a numeric risk value gives them the means to understand what they can do. And if you think about operations or engineering, that's exactly how they solve other problems. Going along with that and setting measurements, important for us during these years and continue now is setting a target for ergonomic assessments, an actual numeric target. I think it helped us set at least a threshold or a certain floor for ensuring plants were making progress on ergonomic assessments. Part of the reason we did this was because some of our plants may even have over 150 different jobs, and it wasn't really realistic for them to analyze all of them all at once or anytime soon. And I think this allowed a more practical a more realistic pace of doing assessments, but yet focusing on them making the decision to focus more on the higher risk areas or areas in the plant and work towards those areas first when it came to assessments. We followed a similar target in the sense of setting a target for ergonomic solutions when it came to implementing fixes or changes on the shop floor. And we also wanted to set a realistic or a practical target. And part of that was also determining, as you saw with the assessment, depending on the number of employees you would have in your plant, this would determine what the quarterly minimum requirement of solutions were per quarter. And for example, if you had 300 employees or 300 or 400 employees, you would be required to submit or demonstrate 5 solutions per quarter. This is a very measurable and specific target that can drive management accountability. And when we were deciding on these numbers, we really had to strike the balance between newer plants that had many opportunities, more opportunities maybe, versus some of the more mature plants who have been doing this program for a while and making sure we strike that right balance. But there's no question that this particular requirement, this specific requirement of targeting ergonomic solutions, was a strong and important driver, even in our ergonomics program today. So a little bit more about this key metric for implementing ergonomic solutions. As I said, it was very vital in our process to the point where, you know, over the last 20 years, it's consistently the highest weighted criteria or requirement in our program. So at any given time over the years, it would be weighted about 25 to 35% of their overall score just on that uh, single numeric target for ergonomic solutions. And I think um, part of that, a little bit more detail, is that we didn't want them just to put in any solutions. They were solutions that were tangible solutions that would have to demonstrate through a risk assessment before and a risk assessment, ergonomic assessment after, showing at least one level of reduction. So if it was a job that was high risk or red, it had to show at a minimum that your change made it down to a yellow or yellow risk or further if possible, but it was a minimum of one level reduction. Implementing MSD risk reduction is critical, as I said, to our whole program. We really felt that other great program elements like doing great training or doing a lot of great ergonomic assessments or having committee meetings, these have limited in value. We felt they had limited in value if the end result wasn't leading to reducing MSD risks for workers, because that was our ultimate goal. And so that's part of the reason why there was so much emphasis and weight put on this in the program. So implementing a systematic ergo problem, as I kind of showed you, sort of our key drivers over those 5 years, the first 5 years. And in the first 5 years, we were mainly tackling North America, and that includes our 90-ish plants at the time that cover Canada, US, and Mexico. So you can see in this chart that when we started in 2007, these are the overall scores of all our plants, the single overall ergonomic scorecard results. So you can imagine in 2007, 80 or 90 of the, sorry, 70 or 80 of these plants were full red. And that makes sense because they were just starting to implement their ergonomics program and they had very few of those elements in our systematic approach. But you can see that over the years, the number of red plants started to decrease and eventually get down to a very low level. At the same time, the number of overall score for ergonomics, the green plants started off at zero or very low and grew to the majority of our plants by the end of 2012, shown in this other circle on the right side. So we certainly saw over those years that a lot of the hard work from our ergonomic committees and teams making good progress on implementing those important aspects of the systematic ergonomics program. We did track also at the same time. We wanted to see, we're putting in some good elements or a robust program, but what kind of impact does it have towards these lagging indicators, which are injuries, ergonomics related injuries or MSDs? And as I mentioned before, the easiest way for us to track them was to look at our US plants. So at the time, maybe our US plants, we had 40 or 50 plants. And this is the severity and the frequency that we saw reduce over those years, especially when we implemented the systematic approach and the metrics. So we did see a decrease in severity and frequency over that period of time. More importantly was the costs, and management is someone who cares a lot about the costs. And one of the things we also tracked was the actual cost for these ergonomic related claims or injuries after we implemented the systematic ergonomics program, which is shown by the green line. So you can see we started we were paying 10 or 12 million per year as far as workers' comp in the US for those plants. And it significantly reduced over the years, and to the point, and this extends way past 2012, but you could see that we maintained a low compensation cost or significantly lower compensation cost over the years due to this program. What one of the recognitions that Magna received from all the hard work from the ergonomics teams and the plants was a innovation award from Michigan OSHA, MyOSHA, where we probably at the time had 15 or 20 plants in Michigan, but the innovation was the system, ergonomic system and implementation of reducing musculoskeletal in the workplace. Due to that process and program that was put in place specifically, they received this award. And so that was really uh, a win situation for those plants. I think it commended their hard work over those period of time, and in a way, it was good to see that not only the risk reduction, but some of our plants and Magnos being recognized for trying to do the right thing for the workers, try to provide the right ergonomics program for the people of our company. As I mentioned, 2007 to 2012 were Canada, US, and Mexico, or North America. With the success of some of uh, these programs, I mean, we were then able in 2012 to roll out pretty much identically the same criteria and the same metrics and the same program and approach in Europe and in Asia, and then later in 2013, South America. So this gets to really my last section of this webinar. And throughout the first few sections, I've talked about, the things that we did to put in this systematic approach and really focused on that. And I think when 2013 rolled around and we've officially launched it globally, we didn't stay still in that sense. And we knew we were probably moving into a more mature ergonomics program for sure, because we had done this for quite a while. But I think in this next section, I'll kind of show you some of the highlights of some of the things that we started to identify as opportunities and really for continuous improvement that we've tried to year out, year in and year out, try to see what kind of value we can raise ergonomics into our company and how do we bolster the ergonomics program and never settle for just staying the same because there's always ways that we can start to, in this case, in 2013, we started, and this still goes on today, but we started in 2000 to really look at the existing Magna systems and really seeing how we could integrate ergonomics into these current systems. So, for example, is the Magna Factory, the MAFACT uh, assessment, which is basically our main operational audit. So every plant globally gets this MAFACT audit, which looks at their performance and how their plant operates. And we were able to integrate an ergonomics value or question rating into that MAFACT operation. Another one is the employee opinion survey, which is a very important indicator for our HR departments. And we were able to get feedback or questions relating to ergonomics within that survey. And lastly, the Magna product delivery process, which is the PDP. This is the process that any new launch, any new equipment, any new workstations would go through, any new lines or product lines would go through the PDP. And we established the MG024, which is a work package that has certain gates and certain requirements when it comes to ergonomics, safety, and environmental, but certain gates as they go through the PDP process, they would have to get sign off on from their management team to ensure that in this case, when it comes to ergonomics, that proper assessments or design have been put in place. Another, in 2014, we also made the decision to upgrade our ergonomics webpage to make it more dynamic and really more centrally organized and easily accessible. It really provided this centralized resource hub. And I think it was we wanted to make sure that there was a one-stop destination for, engineers, ergonomic coordinators, committee members, anybody in the company who had a question about ergonomics or where they get reference material or guidance, they know they would be able to come to this website and find it. In 2016, we also launched more officially our Office Ergonomics program. I think, being a manufacturing company, we did focus on the shop floor ergonomics for many years, as you can see. But we decided at that point that there was significant or it was time to bolster up our office ergonomics program. So in 2016, we built a office ergonomics self-assessment tool through Microsoft Excel. And what you can see the screenshot of this assessment is it was very photo based, where you would a self-assessment, the user would be able to check off which of these conditions their work is set up, and based on what selections they made, there would be customized recommendations on how to adjust their workstation to put it into more optimal postures and more optimal for so that we can reduce MSDs in the office. And so you can imagine there's probably hundreds or thousands of permutations of how different selections people made. So on the back end of the Excel, there were macros that would be able to, depending on your selection, be able to spit out those customized recommendations. So this was the basis of the program, of the self-assessment tool. We did have office ergonomic coordinators who would maybe administer some of these assessments, but also more importantly, a point person on site to be able to address if people had questions or even concerns. In 2017, another great thing that we felt was good for the company was introducing the Ergonomics Best in Class Awards. This was a competition held every 2 years at our face-to-face regional HSE conferences. It really tried to recognize the best ergonomic innovations and solutions. The winners would typically be voted by their peers, and often the winners, they would be the ones that they felt were most practical and real workplace examples that helped other plants that could also replicate some of those solutions. So it certainly was a distinguished honor for them to take the plaque home back to their plant, show their management team, showcase it. But more importantly, it really recognized the contribution and the value of the ergonomics committee. And this is something we continue to do this day. There's one coming up for us at the in the fall for each of these regions. So many of the plants are also excited and more getting excited for the competition, to one up the last time, and depending on who won at the last conference. There was a major change, of establishing, sorry, when there was a major change in 2019 when Magna, as I showed you before, we had a customized web application, and we switched to an industry leading EHS platform called Intellex. I mean, we rebranded it as HSE Links, but it's really the platform of Intellex. But what this allowed us to do was to have all the ergonomics data captured into one system, one platform. So whether it's the ergonomic assessment details, the risk factors, whether it's the solutions that were implemented, the before and after pictures, the WMSDs, that tracking of incidents, these were all housed into this one platform system. And what it allowed was much more robust data analysis, and it allowed us to have much better hold on performance trending, and also allowing us to see where the biggest gaps are within our program. As I said, as we moved forward with this new platform, one of the things we started to develop in 2021 was the ergonomics dashboard. And this allowed a real life live monitoring of ergonomics KPIs on a dashboard. So, for example, some KPIs, for example, is number of solutions you implemented, number of assessments, or number of reported WMSDs. These are all critical ones in our program that they're being measured. And this allowed the ergonomics coordinator or anybody in the ergonomics team to monitor the progress at any point to see where they were as far as reaching their target. So this kept them also on pace during the quarter to meet their quarter end targets. And of course, from the management perspective, it gave them this is just one dashboard, one view, and they can quickly see the results. And if they felt there was something that was not that needed support, they could be able to see this and then go ask questions or go and support how they can reach their targets. In 2023, we moved to ergonomic solution points as a way to measure their implementing. So as I explained before, for many years, we looked at how many number of solutions were put in place by the plant. And we replaced, instead of number of solutions, we went to a solution point system. So they would require a minimum number of uh, solution points now per quarter. And the reason we shifted towards this was because it was trying to incentivize the most effective hierarchy of control. So we know that, whether engineering type of solutions, whether it's control, elimination, substitution, these are the preferred types of solutions. And so this allowed us to emphasize people in the plants to try to implement those types of fixes. Also, you can see that it also incentivized for ergonomic committees to try to tackle the higher risk jobs or the tasks. So how this works is, for example, instead of because what we were getting for many years was some plants, not all, but they would provide the 5 solutions or 7 solutions, and some of them we felt that they were just choosing easy things to do. And what we want to do through this system was to incentivize them to not worry about the number of solutions, but the quality of their solutions. So if the division or the plants would choose to tackle on a job that has a high risk, and in this case, implement a control or solution that related to engineering, they would get 40 points. And this allowed them to get closer to reaching their solution point target for that quarter. The solution sharing database, this is something we launched in 2024. The initiative began a long time ago where we would require plans to submit a before and after solution. And really we asked them to provide that, so in the idea that they would post these solutions up on their boards in their plants. But what we've realized with the new Intellects platform, what we did in HSE Links is that we were able to leverage Magna's scale and size and number of plants by just requiring plants to upload one, maybe their best or one of their best solutions of the year, but just uploading one solution into our database as a requirement per year. And if you think about whether it's 200 or 300 plants, manufacturing plants, that quickly grew our solution database. So we have easily today over 400 ergonomic solutions. And, typically what's in one of these entries is a before and after picture with a description of what they did. They can keyword search for certain items that they're looking for, or they could filter based on categories. But the most important thing was when a plant had a challenge that maybe they ran out of ideas, this was something that they could go to get some concepts or some other things that a similar manufacturing site across the world could use, that was successful, that they could use at their own plant. So it allowed our ergonomics teams to really share the good things that we're doing through this digital ergonomic solution sharing database. The other thing we did was that, and that now speaking of 2026, we're starting to upgrade our office ergonomics program. We moved to an HRS system recently, and so this allows basically all our employees globally, which wasn't the case before, are all under Workday. And this included adding an e-learning training module and also the self-assessments I showed you before, we're able to take that on into this Workday platform. So the self-assessment is now still exists, but now we're able to add the e-learning training into this. So provide more education, provide information on a sort of mini training session for them to gain more knowledge in office ergonomics. The other thing that we're looking at this year as well in 2026 is markerless motion capture software. We already have a few plants or several plants that are already using this technology, but last year we went through a corporate-led pilot to look at multiple plants and seeing how integrating this markerless motion capture software into some of our ergonomic Magna's specific ergonomic assessment tools. So right now we're still on the ongoing evaluation. But our main goal with this and with a lot of the technology that's coming out is how can we um, be more efficient and more effective in our ergonomic assessments? And certainly the motion capture software is one area that we're heavily looking into and hopefully adapting more and more for some of our plants where it makes sense. So those were some of the continuous improvement areas that we looked at. And this is coming down to the last couple slides of today's webinar. And I think with any webinar, there's a lot of information, but I wanted to just kind of put down some key takeaways for everyone. And in our case, for our ergonomics team, and over the years, we've had many corporate ergonomists that have been instrumental in leading a lot of the projects that you saw over this webinar. But I think one thing we could all agree on is some of these key takeaways that were very instrumental. So the first one is establishing a systematic approach to ergonomics program. I showed you earlier when we turned after the pilot project, it really led to the growth of our ergonomics program in those early years after we switched to that systematic ergonomics program. And a lot of that is my second point is that it may not have happened without launching these pilot projects. So my second key takeaway is to always look for these pilot projects that demonstrate tangible value to ergonomics. This is a way that we can sort of get into the door to management to actually justify a bigger change or a more full scale change. Another thing I can't stress more, an important decision we made early, as I said, is mandating engineer partnership right from the beginning. There might be some struggles or resistance because of their time commitment, but for at least that for Magna, this was instrumental in creating successful ergonomic committees and teams. Another key takeaway is setting numeric requirements for ergonomic assessments and also how many solutions you're implementing on a time inside your plants or your company. Being numeric, these requirements are really what we felt held all of our management teams, all our plant managers, held them accountable to a very specific number. And I think that really helped drive the completion of some of these solutions specific that would never maybe would have been done in a timely manner. So that was very key for us. And the last takeaway is never settle. And I think that is one of our core values at Magna. But also, if I look back at some of those things that we covered with the continuous improvement over the years, I think year after year, we always look at, what is it that can help raise the culture and the value of ergonomics in order to grow and strengthen our program over, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And I think we start to see this in some of the small signals over the years, like, in a couple of global employee webcasts, I've seen our CEO reference ergonomics, something that wouldn't have happened years ago. I see some changes in the behaviors, a lot of changes in the behavior of many of the people at our plants and the operations. I rarely receive calls or emails anymore questioning why engineering is leading the ergonomics committee. That alignment is now expected. And most importantly, we see some of these changes, especially in the results. If I look back in 2025 alone, last year, we saw over 4,500 ergonomic solutions implemented across Magna, and 75% of them were engineering-driven changes. So, when I look back to sort of the changes over the years, I can start to see these are some of the small sites that show us that that ergonomics is not just a program, but hopefully it's a part of how we operate, a part of our business now. And I hope to continue to do that in the long term. With that being said, I think if I presented a lot about what Magna's doing, and I think if you followed exactly what we did, it probably would fail because I really believe there's no single right way. I think ergonomics programs must align with your company culture, look at the values in the operation and see how it should be done. Understand the framework, see how it should be done. Decisions evolve. What's right today, I even know at Magna, what's right today, I remember decisions I made years ago might not have been right before. And so that could also change in the future. So understand the decisions evolve. And lastly, priorities and ergonomic programs approaches also continues to adapt. So I think being flexible and agile as AI is coming on strong, technology is. We also have to look at the way we approach ergo programs and continuously adapt. So that's my final takeaway is that there's no single right way. And I think it's up to many of the people on this call to align and understand and build out a framework that works for your company. And so this is my last slide is just a reminder that the MSD Prevention Guideline for Ontario is an excellent. I've been referencing it, like I said, with the icons. This is an excellent way to get started, or even if you wanted to check some of the things you're doing or look at this, whether you're a small company, a medium-sized company, or large company, this gives you some reference material. Again, it's not going to spell out exactly how to run your program, but it gives you the important framework to ask the right questions for you to customize and build it for what makes sense for your company. So please use this as a reference in order to make decisions and build your program. So that's it from me, Kim. Uh,
Thank you so much, Gary. That was a fantastic overview of Magna's approach and your journey over the years. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. At this point, we're going to be taking questions from the Q&A feature. And just a reminder, it can be located in the toolbar through the More button. So please enter questions in the Q&A. Okay, I'm going to start with the first question here. Within your Intellect system, do you have your office ergo assessment questions in a module, or is that still by paper and then entered?
it's a great question. Right now, within Intellects, our ergonomic office ergonomics program is not integrated into Intellects. It's predominantly the manufacturing program. As I said, our first step was integrating into the HRIS system, Workday. But there is going to be the only tie-in we're seeing, what we're going for this year, is that they're going to manage the tracking, the assigning, and the results of the office ergonomic assessments in a way through Workday because it's tied to individuals who have a computer. But for their ergonomics audit, which includes manufacturing and office, they're going to have to show documentation that shows that they've been doing assessments in the office and they've been following up workers that have concerns. So that right now is the only tie-in. They do get evaluated for office ergonomics as part of their these manufacturing plants, but the connection point is between Workday and it feeding into Intellects right now. One day, I hope we could tie the assessment into Intellects, but not right now.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Gary. If you could give your 2005 self a piece of advice that would improve the implementation of a new ergonomics program, what would that be?
Whew, it's a long time ago. Yeah, I think the key takeaways was a good summary of that. But if I could talk to myself back then, I would say is to, and I think that was a big piece of what was happening at the time was really exploring. different avenues of the company, and I think there could have been more. I felt along this journey, what was very important, I kind of stressed that towards the end there, is really learning about things outside of ergonomics, outside of health and safety, outside of HR. Really started dive into operations, dive into quality, or whatever business objectives are important to your company. The better you understand those, um, the more integrated ergonomics you can integrate ergonomics as a tangible value. And I think part of that master's in engineering at University of Toronto was that attempt for me at the time, because I did it sort of mid-career, to really try to learn more about the engineering side. So that would be some advice that I would give to my 2005 self, is to learn a lot more outside of your own scope and what drives the business.
Great. Another question here. Do any sites utilize athletic trainers, and what impact have they had?
We have seen some plants, and I think probably be in the US more that I see is that they have some on-site therapists. Very few, I would have to say, and certainly they've been be able to provide some treatment, and some coaching, but it's usually not it doesn't happen very often. Part of the reason is probably because of the cost. I mean, certainly the ones that invest into it. I mean, Magna's a very, like many companies, very cost conscious. I think that might be one of the reasons, but certainly the ones that did, I did hear some positive feedback as some personal accountability to some of the problems the workers did. But I think they can get that outside the plant as well. But it's a little bit harder for factory floor workers who are tied to the floor. But I do think there's value in it, but we've never measured, because we haven't had enough of our plants that look at athletic trainer therapists on site.
Great, thank you. Just a confirmation question here, Gary. You mentioned you were using Workday for your office ergonomics program. There's a link here to workday.com, and just confirming, is that the platform you're using for office ergonomics? Or maybe talk about the integration there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised this question. It's a really it's not, I mean, people who know Workday HRS system, it's not meant for something like this necessarily. But again, we've innovated in a way where we've used the survey function within Workday, or I mean, there's a third party tie-in software called Articulate that we use, or Rise, that integrates with Workday. So we're able to do the e-learning through that, but then it's really a survey function within Articulate or Workday that we are able to ask those questions or put those pictures to do the self-assessment. So it is a bit of a workaround. As far as not the traditional way that you would see it through Workday, but know that if you know Workday, it's about using the surveys to ask the questions for the assessment, and that's how we're trying to do it.
Perfect. All right. I have someone in the chat asking a question. I may have missed it, but how were workstations assessed at a plant level for materials handling tasks? Was this run by site ergonomists or another cohort?
I think if you talk about material handlers, this is kind of those jobs that may not have a pure cycle time, I think, like a logistics worker. And that's often been a struggle for some of us at Magna, because there is no you know, tight cycle time. And so many years ago, when we were looking at our small lot delivery, we developed a sort of small lot or materials type of tugger route assessment tool that used some bridge of the CLI, or the cumulative lifting index. And so we were able to look at sort of like the cumulative risks related to material handlers, because there's a lot of lifting, as you can imagine, in these positions, and trying to capture it that way. So it wasn't one of the traditional tools that was used for most of the assessments, but certainly this was part of the training that we provided them, the toolkit, as far as using this tool to analyze a more cumulative index. So that's how we tackled material workers. But as you guys know, probably it's a difficult thing to tackle because there's no consistency in the things that they look at from day to day.
Perfect. Thank you. So just being cognizant of time, we won't be able to take any more questions today, but there are a few in the chat. So Gary has agreed to work with us after the webinar to provide some written answers, and we'll send those to the registrants. In closing, I just wanted to thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, and check the events page on the CRE-MSD website for the list of upcoming webinars. And finally, if you haven't already, we encourage you to visit the MSD Prevention Guideline for Ontario, and that can be found at msdprevention.com. And this includes a wide range of resources designed to support workplaces. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming and have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, everyone.